All right. So again, welcome everyone. And we're so excited to actually do this presentation for everyone. Um, we are going to be, the reason why we're doing a general session on SRC is because we actually recognize that every single one of you who is attending this call right now obviously is involved in science fair in one way or the other. And SRC is actually something that you will want to be interested in, at least have a working or an operational knowledge of, even if you're not going to be involved in the whole process itself. Okay, so that's the reason why we wanted to do this as a plenary session. And so before we begin with whatever information we want to share, we want to introduce ourselves. And so I'll pass it on to Elena to introduce herself.
Hi. Hi, everyone. I'm Elena Garza. I work at Clearbrook High School, and so I've been the science fair sponsor here for many years. And I'm really excited to be here. This will be my first year as the Science Research Committee, Scientific Review Committee co-chair. All right.
All right. And I am Dr. John Ramon. I've been involved in science fair since 2007. That was my first year of teaching at Hightower High School. And ever since, I've been deeply involved in up to the state level, and have actually sent a couple of students to the international fair as well. And so just to give you an overview of what we're doing, we purposely did 2 sessions because we recognize that while everyone needs a working operational knowledge of SRC as a process, from students all the way to state or even the regional fair SRC or the district SRC persons, we recognize that the needs are different. Okay, and so we wanted to dive deeper into it in the second session. And the second session is actually not just going to be presentation. It's actually a workshop where we're going to present to you case studies, and you're going to have to work on it and discuss among yourselves to be able to have a deeper understanding of how it actually gets applied, or how the rules gets applied. Okay, and what are the details that you need to actually dive into. And I believe that parents and participants are not gonna need those information, and that's the reason why we have a second session for you guys that's more involved in data analysis and those things. Okay, so with that said, I guess what we always miss when it comes to SRC is we dive into the ocean of SRC, and then we get lost easily just because we don't have a true understanding of what really SRC is all about. And so for this particular session, we wanted to start by addressing that off the bat. Why? Why do we have an SRC process? Okay, and the simple reason is to be able to ensure the highest level of ethical standards for doing research. We are training young minds, students, middle school and high school, to actually engage in the scientific process. And we want them to have a good start to it. Okay, we want them to have an understanding of what they need to be able to consider when it comes to creating a scientific inquiry. Okay, so that's the main reason for SRC. Our main responsibility is really to protect the rights and welfare of students, to protect the rights and welfare of human participants, again, to protect the health and welfare. So if you notice, it's more to make sure, first and foremost, that we ensure the safety of everyone that's involved, whether you're the one implementing or you're the participant, you're the subject. We want to ensure that you are safe. Okay, so that's the one of the guiding principles. The second guiding principle is that to ensure that we adhere to whatever rules and regulations or laws that are involved in the particular research that we're doing. Because of the variety of projects that we get, sometimes there are projects that we don't realize actually has a legal implication to it, especially those that involve human subjects and that involves potentially hazardous biological agents, right? Um, and you also see that playing around in the real world, right? There are certain researches that are not even allowed at the highest of levels. And so it makes sense that we allow our students to understand that they cannot just choose a project and then go run with it. Okay? So those are the things that we want to consider. And because of that, the rules and regulations of ISEF, which we abide by, is put into place. And our role as SRC is to make sure that we comply with those rules and regulations. All right. So that's the whole mindset. Now, with that said, what is SRC really? And so on the next slide, I'd like for you to understand an overall process. SRC is not a committee. Although we say scientific review committee, it's not. I want us to be taken out of that mentality that's a committee. It's actually a process, and it starts with its ultimate goal is, of course, the international fair at the very top, but below it, every state has their own SRC, and at that point, those are committees. Okay, the regional fair, which we are on right now, SEFH is a regional committee, regional fair, has its own SRC. Okay, and where Elena and I are the ones sharing that. But there definitely are a lot more members to it. In particular, most districts which also have their SRC person. I was one for Fort Bend for the longest time, and I was automatically a part of the state committee. Okay, but below that, there would be campus SRCs or IRB. That's where the Institutional Review Board comes into play, which deals with human subjects particularly. And then below that, there are projects, the individual projects, and I've listed there parents, guardians, adult sponsor, qualified scientists, and designated supervisors. I need you to understand that all of those individual people, down to the parents, are part of that scientific review process. Okay? So our role as a committee at the regional fair is, let me be clear that we're not out to disqualify any project. Okay? That's not what our role. Our role is to try to qualify every project to make sure that they have a good experience. But unfortunately, what actually happens is the project has not been screened well at the project level in particular. And that's where all the concerns actually comes in. Okay. And so it's vital that those people at the bottom, the parents, adult sponsor, qualified scientist, and designated supervisor, those four, do a really good job at being able to make sure that the project meets the standards of doing a research by the student, so that when it comes to us, we don't really have much concerns about it. Okay, so that's the reason why I want you to see the overall process. You are part and parcel of this process. Our main goal is really just to make sure that we move projects forward that are eligible, because we don't want them to be disqualified. Okay, so at the onset, we're doing that. Now, I placed here something about how about non-ISD or not district, like homeschool. Some of we've had that before, or if the district doesn't participate or the school doesn't participate, but the student does want to participate, then they work directly with SEFH at that point. Okay, so The rest of the presentation, we'll just go through the approval process, about 25 more minutes, and then we'll leave room for question and answer at the end. So just keep your questions going in the chat, and we're gonna take note of it, and then we'll address those questions towards the end. So the next slide is just an overview of the review process. We know that we are using Scienteer for sure, and that's awesome. Okay, because it's like a turn-by-turn direction, or if you do your taxes, it's exactly the same. It ensures that you never miss something. The problem is, when we shifted to that, we sort of forgot that there are certain forms. The idea about Scienteer is that eventually it spits out the forms that you need to be able to make sure that the project is approved, right? Just to kind of give everyone an idea, this is actually a form that I used like before Scienteer, because I needed my teachers to be able to see firsthand, okay, these are the different forms, these are what you need, these are the required, these are optional, when are they needed, and so on and so forth. And having a checklist like this gives you a very clear-cut idea, at least in an overview manner or bird's eye view manner, that these are the forms that you eventually will need to have, okay? There are actually just 7 forms, but there are A, B, C, like 1A, 1B, 1C, and so on. So we're going to go through each of those, and then give you some more details, and then we'll address your questions towards the end. Okay, so the first form is really the last form that needs to be filled up. Really, it's the very first form in front, but it's really the last form that needs to be filled up for an individual project. Okay, this form is filled up by the adult sponsor. It's basically a checklist to make sure that the student has all the forms in line. And in Scienteer, this actually happens towards the end, where the program already asks you, the student submitted the project for review, and that's when the adult sponsor actually goes through this list, because that's when you check that the form, all the required forms are there. So it's actually nice for an adult sponsor to actually have a printout of this, so that you know if the student actually has everything that they needed. Okay, because it's not presented quite like this in Scienteer. So the second form, 1A, on the right side, that's for students to fill up, and that's basic information about the student and the project. Okay, couple of things that you do need to take note of here is the date, the start date, and the end date. Okay, also Scienteer is pretty good at making sure that that's checked. Students can do at maximum of 3 participants, and this year they are allowed to actually do projects from different campuses, so you can do mixed schools. That's going to be one of the options in Scienteer, in which case they're going to have a filled up Scienteer is going to end up having a form that's more of a mix, where it specifies what school. Okay, but they're going to have to declare which school they want to compete under. Okay, so also the location, that's also one of the picky things. Be aware that there are certain projects that cannot be done at home. Not all projects can be done at home, especially those that would require additional forms and that would involve potentially hazardous biological agents. Those are the projects that are really, really very, very notorious at that. Okay, so they can only be done in specific locations. Okay, so the next form is 1B. The 1B is actually the parent approval. Every student needs to have that parent approval. And so the next slide, that parent approval is basically just to say that they're allowing their student to perform an experiment. Okay, a science fair experiment. This is actually the very first form that they fill up. When they sign up into Scienteer, this form is taken care of off the bat. Okay, so the next form is 1C. Now, 1C is actually a form that's completed at the end of the experiment, because this is a form that's required only if a student did their research in what is called a regulated research institution, like a university or a research lab. Okay, and this form is done past tense, okay, after the fact, after the whole research is done. Okay, next, the qualified scientist form. Now, the qualified scientist, form 2, is one of the forms that has always been misunderstood. And so we want to make sure that everyone is clear about what qualified scientist is. Qualified scientist is one who has shown expertise in the student's field of research. There are projects that needs to be screened by a qualified scientist, and they need to be an expert in that field. So it's not, I know it says they earned doctorate or professional degree in a science discipline, but the one that's almost lost in translation is related to the student's area of research. Doesn't mean that if you have a PhD, like I have a PhD in chemistry, but I actually cannot sign as a qualified scientist for any research that's biology related, because that's not my field of expertise. Okay? You don't have, the other thing is, you don't really need a degree. It can be an extensive experience. And this is one of the things that we actually have a lot of discussion on. Are biology teachers considered qualified scientists? And the answer to that is yes. If you consider that their teaching experience and the degree of involvement they have had in doing particularly culturing, okay, of plates, okay. If they've had extensive research on that, they are very knowledgeable about how to properly or safely conduct that kind of an experiment at school, then they are considered qualified scientists. Okay, this form actually has a filtering question, has some filtering questions, because it's going to ask you what's your degree and what is your experience related to the student's work. Okay, and so that's something that you need to be aware of. Now, that is different from a designated supervisor. A qualified scientist has to screen the papers, especially for potentially hazardous biological agents. It's required. But the qualified scientist does not need to be local to the student, meaning it can be approved or screened by a qualified scientist from another campus, for example. So for middle schoolers who have teachers who are who hasn't had that extensive experience on doing those type of research, you can tap your feeder pattern schools, for example, get one of the biology teachers to actually screen your paper, or if you can have some SRC person at the district level who has that qualification, screen those papers for you. That actually works because they don't need to work directly with the students. If that is the case, then a designated supervisor has to be identified, which in this case can be the teacher, the middle school teacher, that is. Then that's the purpose of the designated supervisor. They do need to have some working knowledge on what the student research is, and work closely with the qualified scientists and educate themselves on how to do certain procedures if needed. Okay, but that's the purpose of the designated supervisors. It's like the adult who is monitoring the student as the student performs it. Okay, so all of these rules are actually in the rules and regulations. We're just giving you the highlights. And so this is, that's a designated supervisor. One of the last forms that I'm going to be discussing before passing this on to Elena to do the rest is Form 3. Now, Form 3 is hazardous chemicals, activities, and devices. I would almost always recommend all projects do a Form 3. It doesn't hurt, okay, to have it, but it's gonna hurt if it's required and you don't have it. If that makes sense to everyone. Form 3 is a very basic form that every single project should actually have. Just so that the students get that mindset that safety is something that we need to pay attention to. This is required for a lot of different projects. If it's a chemistry project dealing with hazardous chemicals, for sure. If it's an engineering project dealing with power tools, that's required. If this is dealing with vertebrate animals, definitely. Potentially hazardous biological agents. Where did you get your sometimes, for example, if they work with E. coli, K to 12, where did you get that from? That's part of the Form 3. So Form 3 is actually, it actually permeates almost all the projects. And so I would just go ahead and do it. Here's the rule of thumb. If you're not sure, or if you're at the border of whether Form 3 is going to be required or not, I would require it automatically. Because if you're already in doubt, think about when it gets to us. Okay? So that's my rule of thumb. And that applies to all forms actually. If you're in doubt on whether it's required, just go ahead and require it at the project level. It doesn't hurt to have all the forms, but it's gonna hurt when you don't have it at the end. Okay, so it's better to have everything and not need it, and then have it or then need it and not have it at the end. That's actually gonna be grounds for disqualification at that point. Okay, so with that said, I believe I can pass this on to Elena.
Okay, thank you so much. And just so you know, if you're requiring it, there's an option as the teacher sponsor or as the SRC person at your campus. There's an option to add a form to the student's project. So if they take them to the survey and the student doesn't say that they need that Form 3, you can always add it for them and they can fill it out. So that's an option. So I just wanted to go through a few of the other forms and talk about some of the things that tend to get the projects kicked back. So things that students need to keep in mind, or you can help them keep in mind as they're going through and filling out their forms. So the first one is on the human subjects form. Now this is Form 4, and there are a couple of forms involved with it, but they need to be pretty specific in the things that they're going to be requiring of their human subject participants. And this will help with the IRB committee so that they have enough knowledge of the project in order to approve it or to send it back and require extra. So with the IRB, your campus does need to have 3 members, and one will be one of the teachers, preferably not the same teacher that's over the student's project. It would be like another teacher in the group that can have some fresh eyes on it and help to see if there are any issues. They're kind of looking at the science of it and make sure that the science is sound and that they're really needing to ask the things that they are of these participants. And then you have human risk evaluators. So that would be maybe the nurse at your campus or somebody that can evaluate the risk level of the participant. So we can't have any more than minimal risk. That includes psychological risk, not just physical risk. So you don't want to do anything that could cause any harm to your participants. And then lastly, you would have an administrator. So the administrator would evaluate any liability and any concern with the project. Okay, so this is a group. So once the teacher approves the project, it's going to go to the IRB if there are human subjects involved. And then the IRB each person of the IRB needs to approve this. It's helpful if you're the sponsor there. It's helpful if you could get the IRB together at any point and go through, pick a day after school, go through the projects that that need to evaluate with human subjects. And that way there can be some discussion between the groups and you guys can make some recommendations for your students. So that's always helpful. So here's what the IRB does. They review, they approve, or they send back for recommendation, or they say that this cannot be done the way that it is stated. They're determining if the student's doing it correctly through a facility or on campus. If it's done through a research facility, that facility must have their own IRB approve it. Cannot be through the school IRB. All right, so if it is at a research facility, it cannot go through school IRB. So please make sure as the teacher sponsor or adult sponsor that you're identifying, and SRC will make sure that it's done as well. So you're evaluating risk level, and then at that point decide if there needs to be a qualified scientist looking through these questions or survey questions they're asking, or any type of experimentation that they're doing on these individuals, and then decide if it needs a qualified scientist or a designated supervisor. Oh, written permission, parent permission. Rule of thumb, anybody under 18 definitely needs parent permission unless the questions are possibly requesting maybe sorry, I've forgotten the word, but requesting just that they don't need, if it's something as simple as, what is your favorite color? That might not be something that needs actual parent approval. So this is something that the IRB would decide. Most of the time you do need parent approval for anybody under 18. And then the second form here is an informed consent, waiver of informed consent. That's what I was thinking of, sorry. So the waiver of the informed consent itself, this is where the student really talks about how everything that they're going to be saying or showing, or if they're playing music, anything that's going to happen with the human participant needs to be here. So if they're showing clips of a video or pieces of a music or asking questions, all of that needs to be attached so that the IRB committee can actually review that before that they make any decisions. So all of this must be very clear when submitting the information. Okay. Last one on this, I think, is they are prohibited from diagnosing any disease. They cannot administer any medication or perform medical procedures. That includes trying out equipment, medical equipment on individuals. They're prohibited from doing that. They would need a designated supervisor and probably qualified scientist at that point to administer these. Okay. So all informed consents, signed informed consent forms must be kept confidential. So at any point, as much as possible, retain the anonymity of the participants. So identifying, giving them a particular number, a participant number, and then keeping that separate so that nobody would know anything that they put on their poster. It doesn't have any identifying factors that they would identify those individuals. Right. Scienteer does do a good job of selecting these forms, but please, please, please check through them and make sure all of that information is there before your IRB sees it, because sometimes the back and forth can take a little bit of time. All right, points of concern. So make sure your IRB checks and signs off. If you're not meeting your IRB together at one time, sometimes it can be difficult because it goes to one person's email, and then we all know our administrators are very, very busy. Our nurses, clinicians, whoever that is going to be for your campus are also very busy. So it just takes a lot of time to go through here. So please try to help your students keep up on this getting signed off. Each one of them must be signed off before they even start their project. And we know the turnaround time needs to be a little bit short because school fairs are starting soon. So they evaluate appropriate risk level. Please do that. Try to do that ahead of time. And if you have questions, talk to your nurses at your school, talk to us, and we can help you out. And then you can't go to SRC unless IRB has a fully approved. So all forms and everything needs to stay with the student when they attend the fair. Okay. All right, vertebrate animals. So a lot of students want to use vertebrate animals for, some of those can be very interesting projects. However, if you can encourage them to try to replace it with invertebrates, if at all possible. Reduce the number of animals so that we're not compromising, or without compromising their statistical validity. If they can reduce it to a minimum, the fewer number of animals affected, the better. Refine experimental protocol to minimize pain and distress of the animal. This will all need to be verified and approved by a veterinarian if they're using vertebrates. And then make sure that they have the utmost respect for the animals and realizing that this is a contribution to research. And so we have these forms that will be approved, needs to go through SRC, of course. But all of the information, they need to be very specific on what species and the number, the sample size that they're using, what's going to happen to the animals after experimentation. Any type of wildlife forms need to be attached, licenses, especially if they're looking at endangered species. All of that needs to be approved. So the signing off form, we do need a veterinarian or animal care specialist, a licensed animal care specialist. If they're only going out and just observing the animal in its natural habitat and they're not affecting it whatsoever, they're not changing anything in that habitat, then you just need a designated supervisor, and that's okay. Your SRC committee should be the one to determine that. And then if an animal dies, now this is a concern, but it does happen. If an animal dies during experimentation, all experimentation has to stop. If it's done at a regulated research institution, then they will have the IACUC review that experimentation. Okay. So just make sure all forms are correctly signed and done beforehand. Pets and farm animals, if they're using pets and farm animals, they can only do standard practices that would already be being done there. And these animals cannot go any pain or distress. You cannot change their water or food intake to affect the health of the animal. That can be very dangerous. The veterinarian needs to sign off on that prior. Now, here's an interesting thing. If they're swabbing animal saliva, which we've had several projects that have done that before, if they're swabbing that is considered a potentially hazardous biological agent. So they will have to sign those other forms. Okay, so that is considered that. Use a designated supervisor for husbandry and tissue. So if they're using any type of animal tissue, they will use the PHBA forms. Okay, if it's at an institution, make sure 5B is filled out afterwards. That form, I think I may have already seen it, but there's a signature part at the bottom earlier. Okay, couple of things that you may not think are considered vertebrates, because a lot of students don't really consider them that way. I mean, but they don't. Bird and reptile eggs, so those are considered vertebrates and are protected under those forms within 3 days of hatching. So you can test on them up until 3 days of hatching, and then you will need to euthanize them. The eggs cannot hatch, all right? Tadpoles, so tadpoles are considered vertebrates, mammalian embryos and fetuses, and fish even after hatching. Zebrafish, they kind of specify because zebrafish are used a lot in experimentation, so up to 168 hours post-fertilization, and then, yeah, so they're still, you can test on them up until that point, and then they're considered vertebrates, okay? Make sure you're following all legal issues with them. If you're catching wildlife, especially fish, so a lot of people want to catch fish, do catch and release with them. Okay, this needs to be prior approved with those authorized officials. They cannot be harmed at all. So I'd have to look closely into that, but I don't think you can use a hook to fish them. I think you'd have to net them. And then we need qualified scientists, designated supervisors, and then behavioral only observations, like if they're only doing the behavioral observations, that doesn't require SRC approval. They're exempt, but everything else will require SRC approval. Okay, let's talk about potentially hazardous biological agents. We've had a lot of projects that do get kicked back at this point because they don't realize the differences between the biosafety lab levels. So let's look at this one, okay? So if you have a student that wants to do restricted bacteria, how do you know what's restricted and what's not? Well, number one, they need to do some research on what the difference between a biosafety lab 1 and a biosafety lab 2 is. Biosafety lab 1 is not at home, but it can be at their high school. So at school, if they've got a designated supervisor there, they can do a biosafety lab 1 type of bacterial project. So anything that's restricted, and you can determine that by wherever they're going to be purchasing their bacteria from. If it's restricted, they won't even send it to the high school. And that's how you know that it needs to be a biosafety lab 2. And let me show you real quick. So 3 and 4 are not even allowed for our science fair, okay? You cannot do biosafety lab 3 or 4 levels of bacteria. Those are pathogenic and we can't use those. So biosafety lab 1, you can do this. However, if they are swabbing things, swabbing doors or swabbing tables or something, and they're plating that, it has to be fully sealed and cannot be opened at all. They cannot open it and sample it in our biosafety 1 lab, okay? Biosafety lab 2 at a research institution, they may be able to do that under their qualified scientist or designated supervisor. Mold is another one we see a lot of projects. As soon as there's any evidence of mold, that needs to be destroyed, okay? Mold can be very dangerous. So if there's any type of mold growth on food, it needs to be terminated as soon as that is seen. All right, so please check the ISEF rules very carefully when using bacteria. All right, and Dr. Ramon, back to you.
All right, so just a couple of final points. We know we presented to you the whole process and all of the forms. But the nice thing is we are actually doing the approval system in Scienteer, and Scienteer is pretty good at walking you through the steps. So the chances of you missing a form is going to be lower than when we did a paper-based one. And the other thing is, the critical part of Scienteer really is making sure that the survey form or the step that asks the students all of those questions, is your project dealing with this, dealing with that, are you gonna be culturing, are you gonna be creating an invention or something like that, are you gonna be using power tools or something like that, that survey, that's the most critical part of Scienteer, I would say, because that is what determines all of the forms that needed to be filled out. If the student does not do a good job at that, tries to cut corners and doesn't answer it accurately, then that's when Scienteer misses to provide that form. Okay? And so my biggest recommendation to everyone, especially if you're the adult sponsor, because the adult sponsor is presumably the one who's going to be working directly with the student to make sure that the student is filling up the form correctly, I would pay attention to that. And I would make sure that according to the students' projects, they fill that form up accurately. That prevents you from missing a form at the end. Okay. The other thing is the research plan. The research plan is not a form. They actually have to create that themselves in a Word document or any typesetting document program. There are minimum required is 5 bibliographies. Okay. Now there are some projects that actually require specific bibliography. Like if you're going to be dealing with vertebrate animal, at least one of the bibliographies has to deal with how to properly care for that particular animal. Okay. In addition to the other bibliographies. Okay. Next, address the testing location. That means that particularly if there's a restriction on where you can perform the experiment, and this often happens when you're dealing with vertebrate animals or potentially hazardous biological agents. That is where you need to if you have a spider sense, like Spider-Man, that's when you need to have a heightened sense that, okay, now I need to check the location. Okay, that prompts you to check the location, because that's what we're doing. When we see the overview of the research, okay, so this is the topic, location. Okay. The location has to be complete address. Can't just be home of student without the actual physical address. So complete that one. Make sure that the research plan is written in third person. This is highly, highly encouraged, just to give them the practice of writing scientifically, because there is also a writing competition, right? So I would promote that as well, so that they get used to writing in third person, referring to them as third person instead of saying I will, or I will do this, I will do that. Okay. Um, Make sure that all forms are completed out by all the different parties. And again, Scienteer is going to be very good at this, assuming that the survey was filled up correctly. Read the research plan in detail. Make sure that you pay attention to the safety, because again, SRC is all about safety. Okay, so try to qualify what the topic is all about, and based on that, you should have a good idea of what kind of forms should be required based on what we presented to you. Okay, and then the last one, the abstract should be something that's required at the end. It's the last thing that it's actually one of the last things that they're going to have to do. And it has to be the official approved abstract in Scienteer. Okay. And it has to be done at the end. There is a presentation on abstract, how to write it, that you can go with your students if you need to, but that's beyond our discussion. But that is what completes the project at the end in Scienteer. Okay, so with that, we have here the official link for Intel not Intel, Regeneron.
Oh,
ICEF.
sorry.
Okay. Now,
I will change that.
So it's Regeneron now, the official sponsor of ICEF. That's the link. We recommend that you go there because there's a bunch of information there that you can use. But if you have any specific questions beyond today that we're not able to address, or we need to pause because we need to actually study ourselves what the question is all about and give you a lot more accurate information on it, feel free to get our contact information. This PowerPoint is also going to be shared with everyone. And so at this time, we have about 13 minutes to address some of the questions. I've tried to address questions directly already from the ones who have typed it. But I think that one of the first questions that I saw is from Thomas.
I can read out some of them too.
Okay.
So
we'll go over that again.
Okay, I see one here that asks if SRC is going to be a voluntary process.
Okay. By voluntary, I'm not sure what that means.
Then I can also, the part of the question asks, can teams directly submit to state or international science fair?
There is actually a rule that a project, to qualify for international fair, they have to go through one of the affiliate fairs. They cannot go directly to international. So what's an affiliate fair? Elena, if you can go to that organizational chart that I showed at the very start.
Sure.
An affiliate fair is one that's officially recognized by Intel, by ICEF, and the one that's recognized is pretty much all state fairs. So Texas State Science and Engineering Fair is an affiliate fair, but actually SEFH is an affiliate fair. If you're an affiliate fair, you can send directly from your fair qualifiers to the international fair, and SEFH can send directly. Now, there is a rule in ICEF that says you have to go through one of the fairs, but it has to be just one. It cannot be multiple. So if you don't win in, let's say, SEFH, can I go to Dallas and participate there? Something like that. You cannot. Okay? The only exception to that rule is if a fair directly funnels into a higher fair, like SEFH sends projects directly to the state fair. And so if you did not qualify to go to the international fair directly from SEFH, you still have one more chance if you qualified to the state fair and then win there and then qualify through the state fair. That's the only way you can qualify to the international fair. Um, in fact, I believe for state fair, you can also qualify directly. You'll have to go through one of the regional fairs. Okay. Now, having said that, regional fair, can you go straight to regional fair without the district fair? Yes, because we do have some homeschool. We have schools that we have schools that do not do science fair, but if a student in a school or a district doesn't participate in science fair, but they do, then we can work directly with that. For that, I would suggest you contact Dr. Ronduin.
Yes, contact our office. Yes. So there are multiple avenues to coming to SEFH. However, keep in mind, if you are a student that attends a school in a district with a science fair, right, you cannot bypass that district fair. Okay. So keep that in mind. CCISD students cannot come to SEFH without going to a CCISD sanctioned fair first. Conroe ISD students cannot come to SEFH without going to the Conroe district. Same thing with A-Leaf, same thing with Aldine, same thing with Fort Bend. There is a process for HISD, which they don't have a formal HISD fair. However, they do have a district manager that filters through the projects that feed into SEFH.
Okay, great. And that helps put a lot more eyes on these projects too, to get those approvals.
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay. So Melissa asked, can you make this form available to us? I believe that was when we were talking about the adult sponsor. We definitely can, but you can also just Google ISDF 2022 SRC forms or adult sponsor form, and it'll bring it up. Yuan asks, can the supervisor be a relative of the students? And I believe as long as the designated supervisor has working knowledge of the project or the content of the project, it doesn't matter if they're relative or not.
Yeah, and so in the chart that you're seeing right now, anything in the line of the project at the very bottom, that can be multiple roles, as long as you qualify in terms of the requirements for that particular role. Now, in Scienteer, the way it works is really the adult sponsor is oftentimes the student's teacher. Is going to be one of the educators in the campus by design. And that is how we would like to really have it set up, because presumably the teacher is the one knowledgeable about what needs to be looked at when it comes to those projects, and that's the reason why we do it that way. But if you're homeschool, for example, then it's gonna be the parent, or you're gonna have to tie up to a school for that one. Any person at the bottom can have multiple roles. Likewise, when you get to higher fair, like if you're in a SRC and you play the role of adult sponsor, then there is a conflict of interest there. So you cannot be the adult sponsor or any of that line on the project. You cannot be one of those and then also be the one in the committee to approve the same project. That's not going to be allowed. IRB or SRC. Okay.
Good. Okay. And Catherine asks, is there a way to automatically trigger Form 3 in Scienteer for all students? And I don't think that there's a way, but as they go through the survey, it will automatically trigger it if they say they're going to use a chemical or a biological agent, or, a lot of the ones that I find that might miss it is if they're maybe using some power tools, but they didn't actually specify that in their survey, but it's in their research plan, then you just have to go in and select the add form and make sure you add Form 3. So that might be something that survey just doesn't miss or accidentally misses just because the student didn't specify as they went through it.
So there's a question here. Are you done?
Yeah.
Okay. So there's a question that I wanted to go back to. If research is done at a research facility with existing IRB, do we need an additional IRB process at the school? And my answer to that would be yes, simply because the student is, representing the campus, and there needs to be an approval by not just the educator and the professional in the school, but also the administrator. There has to be awareness that the student is doing such a project, and I believe in Scienteer that's how it actually works.
Yeah.
Uh,
There's one that says, what about the use of cadaver vertebrates? Maybe they're studying decomposition or something with the tissue. That would just be considered a tissue sample, I believe, and then you would need form, the second vertebrate form, second potentially biological hazardous agent form.
yeah,
And you'd probably need qualified scientist approval for that as well, an animal care specialist or veterinarian.
Okay. For computer science projects that involve open source data and programming, do the students need IRB? It really depends on what you mean by open source data and programming. Because IRB deals with human subjects, basically. If this is going to deal with human subjects like doing surveys and those things, even if it's online survey, you're actually surveying people, then you do need an approval by our IRB. But if it's just coding and programming, then not really.
Okay. And then it said, there's a question that says, for human subjects, does this also need a specific location? Meaning human subjects can only be done on campus and not an offsite location. It can be done anywhere as long as there is a designated supervisor and while they're doing this part of the project, and as long as those locations have already been disclosed on the SRC forms. If it's at a regulated research institution, then they would be under their designated supervisor there, and then they would just need to fill out Form 1C afterwards.
Yeah, and then there's a question here, what if the students do the project at a private company? Do the company also need to to provide the forms? Anytime you do a research outside of the campus that needs to be outside of the school, that needs to be documented, even if it's at home. Now, if it's a private company, definitely you'll have to provide the information for that one, and depends really on the private company. If it's the research division there, that might be considered a regulated research institution, and they will also need to fill up Form 1C for that one.
It also depends on what type of project they're doing as well. If they're doing something with vertebrate animals, then they have certain committees that they go through. If it's something that they do within their company, they have the IACUC forms that they would need to go through. If it's human subjects, they have their own IRB. So it really depends on what type of project it is at the private company.
All right, so there's a question. For human subjects, the slide mentions students must have all the forms and surveys with them at the fair. I know this has been a discussion point before due to confidentiality. Is this meant for SRC verification and then returned to a secure location? Judges should not view this, correct? Yes. No one should ever be asking you to show that form, really. And SRC doesn't actually ask for that. We never ask for that. We ask you for a copy of the informed consent form, because that's one of the ones that we're looking at. But we're never going to be asking you really for the actual field forms. And I would actually not be bringing it to the fair, because no one should ever be looking at it.
I wonder if that was something from a few years ago before this discussion happened. But as a teacher sponsor, I would just, to ensure that your students are actually getting those forms signed, maybe you can check them, quickly just make sure that they are getting those forms signed. But again, you're right, nobody should see those. The anonymity needs to be protected at all times. Right. Blank forms, as well as any survey questions that were asked, anything that was played to them, that information can come with them to the fair. The judges would need to see those, but just not the signed forms.
Okay, there's a question there. Should students do their project off campus, either at home or at a research institution? Does Scienteer provide the paperwork form that that these institutions need to take care of? Yes, if it's a in fact, if it's a designated supervisor, qualified scientist, or a regulated research institution, if they need to fill up those 3 forms specifically, Scienteer will provide you with a link. You're going to have to copy that and paste that in an email, send it to whoever you need to fill up the form. Whoever your qualified scientist is, whoever your designated supervisor is, whoever your person working with in the regulated research institution. They will, in Scienteer, you have to send that link directly. That doesn't happen automatically. Okay? So you're going to have to provide that. And at their end, they don't need to have a Scienteer account. It goes directly to the questions. They fill it up, they sign it, and then you get it back, and then you can proceed.
Okay.
And
Great.
that was
Thank you, Will.
question.
If you have more questions, please email us. Oh, okay, we've got one more question. If
Okay.
only taking pictures, not really using the human organs, go through the risk assessment. Ooh. Again, risk assessment would just be helpful to have. That would be something that I think the IRB would need to approve or, just suggest. If they're only taking pictures, I'm not really sure I can get a good idea of what the project would be, but I think that would be up for the IRBs.
I think it's if they're I've seen projects where they try to develop apps that would try to evaluate a picture or something like that. That might be one of the things that they're looking at. I would still course it through the IRB just to make sure, and that for the risk assessment, the big question there is, where are you actually getting your images from? Okay, the source of it, because if it's a picture that needs to be taken outdoors and someone is taking it, if not you still need to specify how you're getting those images.
Working with X-ray images, in my experience, we have still sent it through an IRB just to ensure that the database that they're getting the X-ray images from is, anonymous, and there is no identifying factors with those X-ray images, because you can still have some HIPAA concerns with that. So I would still send that through an IRB. I think that would be the best way to do that.
Yeah. Well, thank you everyone for the time, and I hope to see a lot of the administrators. And if you're a campus science fair coordinator, or if you're going to be involved in a camp at least in the campus level above, not the project level, or even if you're an adult sponsor, that would actually also work. We hope to see you in the next session, where we're actually going to look at actual case studies and deliberate on it.